If you want the shortest diagnosis of why politics feels insane right now, it's this. The real conflict is not simply left versus right. It's reverence versus management. It's whether a people understands itself as receiving an order it did not invent and therefore owes something like gratitude, restraint, and worship, or whether it understands reality as raw material to be reorganized by experts, administrators, and well meaning engineers. That second posture is called progress, and the modern left wears it openly. But here's the real problem: a huge portion of what gets called the right, especially neoconservatism and its managerial descendants, share the exact same posture. It just wants different managers, different metrics, and different slogans. So if you critique of the left stops at some policy, you'll lose because you'll keep importing the same underlying logic that is abstraction, proceduralism, technocracy, and you'll wonder why winning elections doesn't actually restore civilization. But here's the key and the best thing to look at when it comes to this. Conservatism at its root is not a list of preferences. It's a confession about what the world is. It says reality is not a finally plastic thing that we can play with. There are givens, goods, and limits that precede my will and judge my will. And because of those goods are real, then we have politics is not primarily just this machine for producing outcomes. Politics is a discipline for forming people. And that's why real conservatism always sounds suspiciously moral and suspiciously theological, even when it tries to not be, because it is answering questions that cannot be escaped. What is man? What is he for? What is the good? What must be honored? What must be refused? And what happens to a society that systematically refuses to honor what is real? Then you get the managerial mind. And the managerial mind hates this language. It wants to talk about solutions, efficiency, incentives, systems, stakeholders, deliverables. And those can be useful words until they become a substitute for the truth. And when they become a substitute for the truth, they are not neutral, they are simply a rival religion. And what we end up here is in the neocon temptation, right? That is abstraction as a civilizational software. Neoconservatism is, in many cases, the managerial mind wearing patriotic clothing. Its signature move is abstraction. It treats civilizations like exportable software. Give people the right procedures, the right institutional design, the right electoral rules, the right civil society, training modules, and supposedly you can produce a free society anywhere, in any culture, at any scale, on demand. And this sounds like practical, right? It sounds realistic, but it's metaphysically naive because it assumes that human beings are basically interchangeable units and that order is a product of technique rather than a product of formation. It forgets that stable political order is downstream of moral order, and moral order is downstream of worship, of what people ultimately love. So you get politics that can name procedural goods, elections, rights, markets, courts, while remaining largely silent about the thing that actually sustains them. A thick anthropology with thick virtues and thick loyalties. And when those virtues decay, the neocon impulse is not repentance, it's escalation. More management, more policy, more enforcement, more education. So to think about this another way, the neocon error is not simply that some interventions have failed or that some policies were mistaken. The error is deeper. It treats order as something we manufacture rather than something we participate in. And so we have to look at it as beyond this ideology. Order is not an output. Order is a mode of being. It is the alignment of a people with a reality. And that means order has a teleological shape. It aims at an end that are not invented by some committee. A society is ordered when it knows what it is for, and and it trains its members to love what is good and to hate what destroys the good. When a civilization stops seeing itself as participating in and beyond order itself, it doesn't become neutral, it becomes parasitic. It begins consuming inherited moral capital while denying the source of the capital. It keeps the language of dignity, rights, equality, and justice, but it drains those words of their metaphysical grounding and turns them into tools of power. That's why procedural societies eventually become coercive. Not because procedure is bad, but because procedure cannot supply the moral content it requires. If you refuse to say what the good is, you do not avoid moral claims. You simply allow the strongest moral entrepreneurs to smuggle their claims in under some technical language. And so let's talk about what I consider the Benthamite trap, right? The Benthamite pattern is reduce moral language to preferences, reduce preferences to pleasure and pain, and to reduce politics to the administration of those. So, in this world, the highest virtue that we see often is efficiency, and the highest sin is friction. But a civilization cannot survive on efficiency. Efficiency is a tool, it's not a telos. Once you adopt that posture, you become unable to name good and evil in any type of substantial way. You can say this policy increases GDP, or this policy reduces crime, or this policy improves access, but you cannot at all say what the human being is for. So you end up drifting into these two fates that everybody talks about, either the libertinism, where freedom means appetite with options, or a leviathan, where freedom means compliance with the regime's therapeutic goals. And I'm sure you can notice the irony. The managerial right oscillates between these two. It preaches freedom as choice, maximum options, minimum moral judgment, until social chaos forces it to beg for order. And then it asks the state to impose what the culture refused to form. And the state gladly agrees because managerial systems love crises. Crises justify expansion. If freedom is only choice, then most free person is the one with the most options and the least restraint. But that definition collapses the moment you notice that some choices enslave you. A man can choose addiction, a society can choose decadence, a people can choose lies. And in doing so, they do not become freer, they become more controllable. So the older conservative tradition spoke more carefully. Liberty is ordered. Freedom is not merely the absence of constraint, it is the capacity to pursue the good without being dominated by passions, manipulation, or fear. So, in this sense, freedom requires virtue, and virtue is not downloaded by policy. Virtue is cultivated through practices, habits, institutions, and most of all, worship. And that is why the best small government thinkers, when they are at their best, talk about local habits, thick communities, and self governance. Because the less virtue you have, the more police you need. The less you can govern yourself, the more you will be governed by others. And you can call this culture, you can call it tradition, and you can even call it moral ecology. But whatever the term you prefer, the point is the same. Politics is downstream of formation, and neoconservatism too often imagines it can skip formation and still get order through some type of design. Now, to be fair to this, there is some point here that process does matter. There is a real conservative insight in neoconservatism. No human mind can centrally plan society. There is dispersed knowledge, local context, tacit wisdom, and the need for constraints on power. But this is where the trap is. If you make process ultimate, you treat procedure as the final ground of legitimacy. You end up worshiping method. A proceduralist can tell you how decisions are made. He can tell you why that decisions are worth making. He can explain the rules of the game. He cannot justify why the game should exist, or what even victory means, or why some victories are actually defeats. This is where the managerial right often hides. It claims neutrality. We are just defending the process, but there is no neutrality in moral universe. If your process is detached on account from the good, it will be captured by whatever moral force is willing to use the process as a weapon. That's why this procedural conservatism inevitably loses to revolutionary movements. Revolutionaries offer a telos. Proceduralists offer a rule book. And in a crisis, people will accept rule breaking if they believe it restores meaning. So, the managerial imagination, whether left or right, is haunted by the same fantasy the good regulator. Some set of experts, more rational, more informed, more objective, who can see the whole system, optimize the whole system, and steer the whole system. But it's very clear in any complex society that is counterfeit omniscience. It assumes a view from nowhere. It assumes that the regulator can know enough to manage what is fundamentally beyond full management. The living complexity of persons, communities, histories, loyalties, and moral meaning. So again, what ends up happening? Either the managers lie to themselves or they begin coercing reality to match their models. And because reality keeps resisting, they interpret this resistance as a pathology. Dissent becomes misinformation. Tradition becomes irrationality. Religion becomes extremism and fundamentalism. Local knowledge becomes bias. The conservative response in reality is not to reject expertise, is to reject a salvific expertise, to insist that the only being who could truly regulate the whole is the one who knows the whole, not a data, but as creator. That is why the deepest anti technocratic argument is ultimately theological. If conservatism is a metaphysical confession, then conservative politics is primarily about constraints and formation, not utopian blueprints. It means you start by naming reality. Man is not a blank slate. He is not basically good in the modern sentimental sense. He is capable of great good, but he is also fractured, easily deceived, easily tempted, easily self justifying. So a sane regime does a few basic things well. And we can see here, this is going to be mostly about virtue and justice. It limits centralized power because concentrated power attracts the worst people and tempts even decent people. It protects the mediating institutions, family, church, local associations that actually form virtue and meaning. It honors limits, moral limits, natural limits, economic limits, even epistemic limits. It resists politics of permanent emergency. It remembers that law cannot replace culture. If you use law to do what only culture can do, you will either fail or you will become a soft tyranny. None of this, none of this is going to guarantee a paradise. Conservatism is not a promise of paradise. It's a refusal of the false paradises offered by a managerial system. Systems that promise peace through control, harmony through re education, and freedom through procedure. So the argument is simple, even if it has deep roots. Neoconservatism often shares the modern liberal metaphysic: abstraction over participation, procedure over formation, management over reference. It tries to defend the products of a moral tradition while treating that tradition as optional. But you cannot indefinitely preserve fruits while denying the roots. A civilization that forgets what it worships will eventually worship itself, and a civilization that worships itself will eventually be ruled by those who are willing to manage it. The alternative here is not rage, it's not naivety, nor a new set of managers that we just keep picking. The alternative is to recover the real metaphysical confession here, to name the good, to honor the real, to accept limits, and to rebuild the institutions that form persons capable of self governance. Because if people cannot govern themselves, someone else will happily do it for them.